I think the differences, the variations, the colors in his personality, black one time, white one time, up and down, hot and cold. He was a difficult man to pigeonhole.
This 1970 war epic isn't just one of the greatest movies ever made. It is a film surrounded by secrets, feuds, ego clashes, historical mysteries, and behind-the-scenes decisions that nearly derailed the entire production multiple times.
They don't know whether you're acting or not. He says it's not important for them to know. It's only important for me to know. Those who were with him and were on his side were definitely on his side, and they followed him religiously.
From a refused Oscar that shocked Hollywood to real military revolvers that ended up in a museum. From a director who lied to his lead actor to get the performance of a lifetime, to soldiers literally standing at attention in movie theaters across America. These are the facts that make Patton so much more than just a war movie. Stick around, because some of what's coming will genuinely stop you in your tracks. Number 1. The film opens with no studio logo, and it was a deliberate, aggressive choice. When you sit down to watch a 20th Century Fox production, you expect the fanfare. You expect the logo, the music, the gradual and comfortable easing into the world of the film. Studio branding at the beginning of a film in 1970 wasn't just tradition, it was contractual, it was marketing. It was part of how the major studios maintained their identity and their authority in an era before home video and streaming made films accessible in 100 different ways. That logo was a signal. You are in safe hands, you know what kind of product this is, and you can relax. Patton gives you none of that. There is no studio logo, no opening credits sequence, no slow build. The screen just cuts straight to a soldier walking out onto a stage in front of one of the most enormous American flags ever put on film. The decision to strip out the studio branding required a deliberate choice at the highest level of the production. A kind of confidence in the material that said, "This film doesn't need our name on it to command authority. It announces itself." And that is exactly what it does. From the very first frame, Patton establishes itself as something different, something that operates by its own rules and on its own terms. The absence of the logo isn't just a stylistic choice. It's a statement of intent. You are not being eased into this film. You are being dropped into it cold, without comfort, without transition, without buffer. The aggression of that opening decision perfectly mirrors the aggression of the man the film is about. Patton begins exactly the way Patton himself would have begun it, without apology and without ceremony. Number 2. The first voice you hear belongs to an uncredited character actor. That voice that cracks across the silence, Ten Hut, belonged to character actor Claude Akins. It is a piece of trivia that even the most devoted fans of the film often don't know. Akins wasn't credited for the moment, wasn't promoted as part of the ensemble in any significant way for that single contribution. He was a working actor with a long and respectable career in television and film, but his role in the cultural history of Patton comes down to 2 syllables. And yet those 2 syllables matter enormously. His voice is the literal first thing you hear in one of the most celebrated American films ever made. Before Scott speaks a word, before the flag fills the screen completely, before the fanfare of Jerry Goldsmith's score kicks in, Claude Akins says, "Ten Hut," and the film begins. That word is the entry point into the entire world of General George S. Patton, and most people who've seen the film a dozen times still couldn't tell you who delivered it. Number 3. Soldiers in movie theaters across America literally stood to attention. When military audiences heard that opening command, something remarkable happened that nobody in the production had entirely planned for, and that speaks to the visceral, almost physical power of the film's opening moments. Veterans and active service members watching Patton in cinemas across America reportedly rose from their seats the moment that command hit the speakers. Not metaphorically, physically. Their bodies responded before their minds could intervene. because years of military training had built that response so deep into their nervous systems that a darkened movie theater offered no protection against it. That is an extraordinary thing. A film made it happen. A recording of a command, played over cinema speakers, triggered a full physiological military response in trained soldiers who were ostensibly sitting down to watch a movie. Think about what that says about the power of the film's opening, about how completely and immediately it placed its military audience inside the world it was creating. The film hadn't even started yet, and it had already broken through the screen. It also tells you something about the filmmakers' understanding of their audience. They knew who was going to be in those theaters. They knew that a significant portion of their viewers would be veterans, would be active military, would carry that conditioning in their bodies. They didn't design the opening to trigger that response, but they created the conditions in which it was possible. That is filmmaking that respects its audience deeply enough to take them seriously. Number 4. George C. Scott didn't want to film the opening monologue. Here is what most people don't know. George C. Scott didn't want to film the speech, not because he thought it was badly written, quite the opposite. Scott was, by any measure, one of the most talented and most difficult actors of his generation. He was brilliant, he was committed, and he had very strong opinions about the craft of acting and how films should work on an audience. And when he read the script and saw that the film was going to open with this enormous, overwhelming monologue in front of a giant flag, his instinct was that it was a serious structural mistake. Scott's concern was that the speech was too good, too powerful, too completely dominating. His argument was that it set an impossible bar for everything that followed. How do you come back from 6 minutes of that? How does any subsequent scene, however brilliantly written, however well performed, compete with a monologue of that scale and intensity delivered at maximum force right at the start? In Scott's view, the film would peak before it had really begun, and then spend the next 2 hours and 45 minutes trying to live up to something it could never reach again. It was a thoughtful objection from a serious artist. It was also, as it turned out, completely wrong, but only because of a deception that produced one of cinema's great performances. Number 5. Director Franklin J. Schaffner lied to his lead actor to get the performance. When George C. Scott objected to opening the film with Patton's massive speech in front of the American flag, Schaffner didn't argue with him. He lied. Scott worried the speech was too powerful to come at the beginning because it might overshadow everything that followed. So Schaffner calmly told him the scene wouldn't open the movie at all. According to him, it would appear near the end as the film's emotional climax, the final thunderclap before the credits rolled. Scott believed him and committed completely to the performance. The result was 6 minutes of pure, controlled intensity, now considered one of the greatest monologues in film history. Then Schaffner put the speech exactly where he always intended, right at the beginning. By the time Scott realized what had happened, the film was already built around that decision. And honestly, Schaffner was right. The speech works because it overwhelms you immediately. It establishes Patton as a myth before the movie slowly complicates that image scene by scene. It was a calculated deception, but Hollywood history suggests Schaffner absolutely made the correct call. Number 6. The revolvers on Scott's hips were the real thing, now preserved at West Point. When George C. Scott appears in the opening scene, the ivory-handled Colt revolvers on his hips aren't props. They aren't replicas either. They are the actual sidearms carried by Patton during World War II, the same iconic pair seen in wartime photos from North Africa, Sicily, and France. For the production, using the real weapons wasn't just a detail, it was a statement. Patton's revolvers were part of his entire public image, instantly recognizable to soldiers and historians alike. So putting the originals on screen added a layer of authenticity that a recreation simply couldn't match. After filming, the revolvers were placed in the United States Military Academy Museum at West Point, where they remain today. So the same weapons that once sat on Patton's hips in wartime and later on Scott's during one of cinema's most famous performances now sit behind glass as museum artifacts. A rare object with a double legacy, war and Hollywood, frozen in one display. Number 7. The real Patton had a high-pitched voice that didn't match his image. General George S. Patton had a high-pitched voice. This is one of the most startling historical facts about the man, and it is one that the film, perhaps deliberately, perhaps wisely, chose not to recreate. Not a deep, commanding baritone, not the resonant, authoritative instrument that George C. Scott brings to the role. The real Patton's voice was notably higher than people expected, given his physical presence, his personality, and his reputation. People who met him in person were routinely surprised by it. It didn't match the image at all, the imposing frame, the aggressive posture, the imperious manner. The voice belonged to a different kind of man. George C. Scott made the decision, consciously, not to replicate this vocal reality. The Patton that Scott created needed to be a mythic figure, larger than life, commanding from first appearance, impossible to look away from. A high-pitched voice, however historically accurate, would have undercut that mythology from the first line of dialogue. Scott understood that his job was to create the Patton of legend rather than the Patton of the historical record, and his voice was the instrument through which that legend was built. Number 8. Patton used profanity as a deliberate psychological strategy. Patton's use of profanity wasn't just personality, it was strategy. He understood a blunt truth about himself. His natural voice didn't always carry the kind of instant authority some commanders could project just by entering a room. So he engineered a workaround. The profanity, the sharpness, the shock factor, all of it was designed to cut through hesitation and force attention. It made his presence louder than his physical voice alone could manage. Instead of relying on quiet authority, he leaned into intensity. Every curse, every abrupt order, every verbal jolt was part of a controlled performance meant to dominate a space before doubt could creep in. And it wasn't limited to language. The polished uniforms, the ivory-handled revolvers, the theatrical public image, it all worked together. Patton wasn't just giving orders. He was staging command itself. For a man obsessed with control, even his most chaotic-sounding behavior was carefully constructed. Number 9. Scott called the Oscars a meat parade and refused to participate. Scott made his stance on the Academy Awards clear before the 1971 ceremony. He formally asked the Academy to remove his name from Best Actor consideration. His objection wasn't performative humility, but principle. He believed acting couldn't be ranked or compared across different roles in films without stripping it of context and meaning. To him, awards reduced collaborative work into a competitive spectacle. He saw the Oscars as less a celebration of craft and more an industry showcase of vanity, complete with cameras, gowns, and carefully staged gratitude. He famously called it a meat parade, a phrase that stuck because it perfectly captured his disdain for the event's tone and theatrics. The Academy refused his request and kept him on the ballot anyway, setting up one of the most ironic moments in Oscar history when George C. Scott ultimately won the award he had rejected in advance without attending the ceremony itself either. Number 10. His seat was empty when Goldie Hawn read his name. The 43rd Academy Awards ceremony took place in April 1971. When Goldie Hawn opened the envelope for Best Actor and read George C. Scott's name, there was a moment of complete and profound uncertainty in the room. Everyone present knew that Scott had said he wouldn't accept the award. They knew his position. And yet, here was the envelope, and here was his name, and here was the empty seat where he wasn't sitting. A producer accepted on his behalf, and the evening moved on, but the moment had already crystallized into something that would be discussed for decades. Scott never collected the Oscar. He didn't acknowledge the win in any meaningful public way. He simply continued not participating, with the same consistent indifference he had expressed before the ceremony. It wasn't performance. It wasn't a calculated piece of countercultural theater. It was entirely, authentically, completely consistent with who George C. Scott was as a person and as an artist. The refusal became part of the legend. It added another dimension to the mythology of the film and to Scott's own legacy. You cannot separate the award from the refusal, and you cannot separate the refusal from the man. They are all part of the same story. Number 11. Patton won 7 Academy Awards that night. Whatever one thinks of the Oscars as an institution, and Scott's opinion was clearly documented, the breadth of Patton's success at the 43rd Academy Awards is worth dwelling on because it speaks to how completely the film dominated the cinematic conversation of its moment. Best Picture. Best Director for Franklin J. Schaffner. Best Original Screenplay for Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North. Best Film Editing. Best Art Direction. Best Sound. And Best Actor, the one that sat uncollected. 7 awards in total. That is a sweep by any standard, a declaration by the Academy that this film had achieved something that separated it from everything else released that year. The context matters too. This was 1970, one of the most creatively fertile years in American cinema. The industry was in the middle of its new Hollywood revolution, producing films of genuine artistic ambition and social daring. The competition was real, and Patton, this sprawling, old-fashioned, 3-hour war epic about a World War II general, walked away with 7 awards. It remains one of the most dominant performances in Oscar history. Number 12. The film covers only a fraction of Patton's life. By deliberate design. Patton is technically a biopic, but it's far more selective than most people realize. The real Patton lived a huge, eventful life long before the film begins. Born in 1885, he graduated from West Point, competed in the 1912 Olympics, served during the Pancho Villa expedition, fought in World War I, and became one of America's earliest champions of tank warfare. He spent years battling military bureaucracy and trying to modernize armored combat during the lean interwar period. The movie ignores almost all of it. Instead, the story begins in 1943, after the disaster at Kasserine Pass, when inexperienced American forces were badly defeated by the Germans in North Africa. Patton arrives to restore order and rebuild morale. That choice was deliberate. The film argues that Patton was a man truly built for war. Everything before it is treated as setup. The war itself is the real story. Number 13. Karl Malden's real birth name is hidden inside the dialogue. Karl Malden plays General Omar Bradley in Patton, and he brings a quiet, steady authority that works as a perfect foil to George C. Patton's explosive personality. Where Patton is theatrical and volatile, Bradley is measured and calm. That contrast quietly anchors the film's tension, but there's a detail tucked into the script that most viewers miss completely. In one line of dialogue, the name Sekulovich is spoken. It sounds like background military jargon, something you'd forget immediately. It isn't. Malden's real birth name was Mladen Sekulovich. He was the son of Serbian immigrants, and like many actors of his era, he changed his name to something more Hollywood-friendly when he entered the industry. Karl Malden became the public identity, but Sekulovich was his original one. By slipping that name into the film, the filmmakers created a small private nod inside a massive production. On the surface, it's just dialogue. On another level, it's a quiet acknowledgement of Malden himself, hidden in plain sight. It's the kind of detail that shows how carefully layered Patton really is, even in moments that feel incidental. Number 14. The film is rated PG, which feels almost impossible given the content. Patton is rated PG. Sit with that for a moment, because it seems almost absurd given what you are actually watching. The slapping of a soldier suffering from combat stress. frank and sustained profanity, the physical and psychological reality of industrial-scale warfare. A portrait of a man who is, by any reasonable measure, deeply psychologically damaged by his own magnificence. The PG rating reflects the standards and calibrations of 1970 rather than contemporary ones, and it's worth noting that the rating system itself was relatively new, having been introduced in 1968. By the standards of today, the film would almost certainly carry a more restrictive rating. But the rating also points to something real about the film's fundamental nature. For all its intensity, Patton is a cerebral film. It is a film about ideas. It treats war as something serious and terrible and consequential rather than as a backdrop for heroics. And it is more interested in the interior landscape of its subject than in the spectacle of combat. It is demanding of its audience in a way that earns a certain respect, and perhaps a certain leniency from a rating board that understood what kind of film it was looking at. Number 15. At 2 hours and 51 minutes, it earns every minute. Patton runs for 2 hours and 51 minutes. In contemporary cinema, where studio pressure to keep films under 2 hours is relentless, and audiences have been increasingly conditioned toward shorter attention spans, that runtime feels almost defiantly ambitious. And yet, the film earns every minute of it, because it needs every minute to do what it is trying to do. The film covers an enormous amount of historical and narrative ground: North Africa, Sicily, the slapping incidents, the D-Day deception, the breakout across France, but it is never primarily interested in the events themselves. It is interested in the man moving through them, and in how the events reveal him, complicate him, expand and diminish him simultaneously. That kind of sustained psychological portraiture requires time. It cannot be compressed without losing the texture and the accumulation that make the portrait finally convincing. There is not a wasted scene in this film. Every sequence advances the portrait. Every scene adds something that the next scene will need. It is one of the most precisely constructed films of its era, wearing its length not as an indulgence, but as a structural necessity. Number 16. The production had an almost obsessive commitment to historical authenticity. One of the qualities that separates Patton from most war films of its era, and from most war films made since, is the almost obsessive commitment to period and historical authenticity that ran through every department of the production. This wasn't a film that was willing to approximate, it was a film that pursued the real thing wherever it could be found. Every department, costumes, props, vehicles, military hardware, worked extensively with military consultants and historical advisors. The insignia on uniforms were verified. The vehicles were sourced to be period accurate. The set dressing was checked against historical photographs. The filmmakers understood that a significant portion of their audience had actually fought in or lived through the events being depicted, had been there in some cases, and they knew those audience members would notice errors. They would be pulled out of the film by inaccuracies. Getting the details right was not just artistic pride. It was a matter of respect for the people and the history the film was engaging with. That commitment created a film with a physical weight and an authenticity of texture that cannot be faked and cannot be replicated in post-production. It has to be built into the production from the ground up. Patton built it. Number 17. Real tanks were used in the battle sequences, and the difference is visible. There are no CGI tanks in Patton because there was no CGI in 1970. The tank sequences use real tanks, real machinery of real weight and real presence, moving across real landscapes, creating real dust and real noise and a real sense of physical scale that digital effects have spent 50 years trying to replicate and have never quite managed. Shooting in Spain gave the production access to the military hardware and the geographical variety it required. The landscapes could stand in convincingly for North Africa. The Spanish military made hardware available that would have been impossible to source in the United States. The scale of the production, the tanks, the troops, the logistics of staging military-scale set pieces on location was extraordinary for its time and budget. There is something irreplaceable about real physical mass on screen. When a 50-ton tank rolls across a ridge and the camera shakes with the weight of it, that shaking is real. The dust is real. The noise is real. The men inside are real. All of that reality accumulates into a physical texture that the audience feels without being able to articulate why. A bone-deep sense that what they are watching is not simulation, but record. Patton has that quality throughout. It looks like war because it used the real weight of the world to create its images. Number 18. President Nixon reportedly watched the film multiple times during Vietnam. Patton was released in February 1970 in the middle of one of the most turbulent and divisive periods in American political history. The Vietnam War was at the peak of its domestic controversy. The military was deeply unpopular with significant portions of the American public. The idea of producing and releasing a film that celebrated a general, any general, let alone one as aggressive and controversial as Patton, felt to some like a provocation and to others like an act of cultural defiance. The film reportedly screened at the White House on multiple occasions. President Richard Nixon was said to have watched it several times during the Vietnam War era, and there were credible reports at the time that it influenced his thinking about military leadership and the exercise of executive authority in wartime. Whether or not those reports capture the full picture, the larger point is undeniable. Patton was not received merely as entertainment, even at the highest levels of power. It was functioning as a living argument about command, authority, and what it means for a nation to choose a particular kind of leader in a particular kind of moment. People with actual power over actual military decisions were taking it seriously as a document about those questions. That is an extraordinary thing for a film to accomplish, and it says everything about the depth and seriousness of what Coppola, Schaffner, and Scott had actually made. Number 19. Francis Ford Coppola co-wrote the script, and The Godfather's DNA is all over it. Francis Ford Coppola shared the Best Original Screenplay Oscar with Edmund H. North for Patton. And when you know that, when you watch the film with that knowledge active in your mind, you begin to see it everywhere. Coppola brought to the material a literary sensibility that was interested in myth, in the tragic arc of the outsized individual, in the way that greatness and catastrophe are not opposites but expressions of the same fundamental nature. He was interested in men who are too large for the institutions they serve, men who are indispensable and simultaneously ungovernable, brilliant and self-destructive, masters of their domain and prisoners of their own character. Patton is exactly that kind of man. And the Godfather films, which Coppola would begin making almost immediately after Patton, would return to exactly that kind of man. Michael Corleone, Vito Corleone, men of extraordinary capability and vision, whose very gifts become the instruments of their destruction. The interest in classical tragedy, in the figure who rises to the heights of their power and then falls because they cannot be other than what they are, is the same in both projects. Patton is, in many ways, the prototype of the Coppola protagonist. Watch it after watching The Godfather, and the family resemblance is unmistakable. Number 20. The behind-the-scenes story has become almost as famous as the film itself. The refused Oscar, the speech that was filmed under false pretenses and placed exactly where the director always intended. The real revolvers, now preserved at West Point. The voice that Scott chose, consciously, not to replicate. The birth name buried inside a line of dialogue. The soldiers standing at attention in theaters across America. The president watching it in the White House and reportedly drawing sustenance from it. These facts have become almost as discussed and celebrated as the film itself, and that almost never happens. Productions, as a rule, disappear behind their finished products. The machinery of making the film is invisible by the time the film is in theaters. What you see on screen is all that exists publicly, and the months or years of decisions and compromises and arguments and accidents that produced it dissolve. Patton is different. The making of Patton became part of what Patton is. Its behind-the-scenes story is inseparable from its cultural identity, as famous in its own right as any of the scenes on screen. That kind of sustained public fascination with the film's production history, more than 50 years after the fact, is the mark of a film that operated at a genuinely exceptional level on every front simultaneously. When you watch Patton today, you are watching all of that history, even if you don't know it consciously. It's in every frame. The film demanded to be taken seriously, and more than 50 years later, it still is. And that is 20 facts about Patton, a film that earned its legendary status both in front of the camera and behind it. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this kind of deep dive into the films that actually deserve one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we do this every week. And drop a comment below. I want to know, what's the fact from this video that surprised you the most? Which one are you going to tell someone else about? I read every single comment, and I reply to as many as I can. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.